fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
I did some reading recently on a couple of books about game theory, and this is going to be part of a larger little arc we have about the marketplace, about chaos theory, about fractals and things like that. But I wanted to start with game theory. It's something you hear brought up a lot, even though people don't like it. Some people don't like it, but I think they just have a lack of understanding on it. And while some people might think game theory is a way to interpret and plan for all of human affairs, I disagree with that, but I do think there's enough truth in it to be seen as something interesting that people should know. And you talk about game theory, it's very complicated. It's a mathematical model. It's a convergence of mathematics and psychology and anthropology and sometimes physics. But there's lots of books written about it, very reputable books. It's popular with economists. I can never say that right for some reason.
What?
Economists. Yeah, don't sound so aghast.
Economist? You can't say it.
Yeah, if I'm in a rhythm, it sticks
All right.
out.
Okay.
Don't act like this is beyond the pale. Economist? What the fuck, you stupid queer? You can't say. We all have our queer. All geniuses have words they can't say.
Fair enough.
Or words they can't even hear.
And you're so smart. You're so smart. There's like a shit ton of words you can't say. You're a super genius.
The smarter you are, the more basic words you can't hear. This is why, a lot of geniuses don't understand the word no.
Yeah.
And that you want to know how they can persevere in industry, but also get into sexual trouble. Well, there you go. This is why they had to keep Einstein away from Anne Frank.
Yeah,
that's why they got rid of him.
Geniuses are just people who understand that no means yes.
I'm saying this is why they got Albert Einstein out of Germany, because they had to get him physically away from Anne Frank. He just didn't know what no means.
So what you're saying is the concentration camps were actually humanitarian. You're trying to save normal Jews from those fucking rapists at the Manhattan Project, right? That was the...
Yeah, no, I believe that Jews do have a high verbal IQ, and I do think that Jews are very scholarly people. What I'm saying is that's the worst thing the Nazis did was put Anne Frank around other Jews. Imagine what they did to her.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So that's why I say, look, I agree the Nazis were evil. What they were evil for was putting all these Jewish women around Jewish men. That's the real Holocaust, but y'all not ready to talk about that.
I ain't scared of you motherfuckers.
That's basically game theory.
Nailed it. We're done.
See you guys later. See you next time on whatever this show is called. No, but so game theory, I wanted to get into it because I heard about it, and I've actually read books when I was younger, and it just never clicked for me. I read these books, and they would say, "Oh, here's some theories about game theory. Here's some scenarios, and here's some puzzles." And I'm like, "Okay, I get it. I remember the puzzles, but what do you mean? Like, what is this? You keep saying it's mathematical, but what are the mathematics?" So I read these in my 20s. There's this book called Thinking Strategically that's very popular. When you talk about game theory, this one will come up. It's called Thinking Strategically, the Competitive Edge in Business, Politics, and Everyday Life by a couple of guys. Now, here's one for you. Avinash K. Dixit. I don't know what type of guy that name belongs to. Barry J. Nailbuff. That's kind of cool.
He works at the salon.
And then there's one called Game Theory, a very short introduction by Ken Binmore by Oxford Press. I'm just like, give me the skinny on game theory, and just don't give me a bunch of puzzles. Like, what do you actually mean? So just to get a foundation and to say, here's a 360 view of what it is, what I think it could actually solve and address, and where there are sort of fault lines in it that I think people overestimate. So just to give you and me and all the good friends of the show, here's what it is. So when people talk about game theory, it's a way of kind of choreographing and organizing interactions between people. So this has applications to politics. This has applications to sociology and all kinds of things. So, but they say that the main fault of game theory is that it presupposes that you need to be a completely rational actor and that people are irrational. So, and if people hear that and they interpret it as meaning, oh, so for this to work, people basically need to be machines. They need to be completely rational and reasonable at all times. They can't fall victim to their own biases and whatnot, which actually isn't true. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But that's why they say, oh, game theory is nice. It's a good theory to talk about how machines might interact, but it doesn't. They're religious and they're spiritual and they have these motivations that we don't understand. That's not actually true. But game theory as a whole can also adapt to kind of irregular players is kind of what I'm trying to get at here. So a game is being played whenever humans interact. That's kind of what it means. When you are making a deal, when you're doing any kind of transaction, dating could be seen as one, selling something on Craigslist could be another, politics, anything could be seen as a game when humans interacting. But more specifically, a game is described as strategic dependence requiring the choices of another person acting independently. So to be a game, there has to be a strategy between the people. There has to be a way you're negotiating or a way the transaction, rules that are kind of being adhered to. And one side wants one thing and another side wants another thing. And that they need to be working independently, kind of not necessarily at odds, but they have something they're trying to sort out. So in a lot of ways, a conversation could also be seen as game theory. Like if you want to get very broad with it, like you're talking to someone, you're trying to get an idea across, you're trying to work within these rules, trying to imagine things from their perspective, but how you can get your point across. That's where you're utilizing empathy, trying to predict what they might say back. Things like it's a game in a lot of ways. So you can apply this in a lot of transactions. Now, just to start, where I will say this kind of goes wrong, or it gets difficult, not goes wrong, but gets difficult, and they would even admit this, is where two ways. One, where a person is acting irrationally. So when they say irrationally, what they mean is unpredictably. It doesn't mean silly. It doesn't mean that the reason you're doing what you're doing is crazy, because you can actually factor in craziness to this game. But if it's like something that's truly unpredictable, so let's say you're negotiating with a real estate agent and you're kind of doing the things, then he shits his pants. Now you're like, I don't know what this is now. This changes everything. You know what I mean? Like there could be curveballs in the world, and we'll get to this in a later clip where we talk about the true nature of unpredictable events and black swan events and whatnot. But for someone to really truly behave irrationally means to truly behave unpredictably. And another thing that I think throws the biggest curveball in is when you're having a negotiation between three people or three or more people, which is where you get into, in my opinion, more geopolitical things. So what I mean by that is, so we get into, in physics, this is called the three-body problem. Now, people don't know what the three-body problem is. It's in cosmology where if you have two objects of mass that get in orbit around each other, once they do that, we can kind of predict their orbit indefinitely. So, the Earth and the moon or anything that's kind of orbiting around each other, as long as it's two, and even if there's little things that happen, we can kind of predict the decay of the orbits for 1 million years out. And if we introduce an object, we can kind of tell how it balances out. The moment you include a third object in there, even just one more object, it's just chaos. You cannot have a stable system. You have an unpredictable system for quite some time, and then it'll eventually fly apart.
Initially, a two-body system appears to have more unknown variables for position and velocity than equations of motion. However, there's a trick. Consider the relative position and velocity of the two bodies with respect to the center of gravity of the system. This reduces the number of unknowns and leaves us with a solvable system. With three or more orbiting objects in the picture, everything gets messier. Even with the same mathematical trick of considering relative motions, we're left with more unknowns than equations describing them. There are simply too many variables for this system of equations to be untangled into a general solution.
And the moment you add a third body is like it becomes unpredictable in so many different directions. So if you have, let's say, a geopolitical situation where in a lot of ways it always shakes out being really two, like the West versus the East, and you might have a lot of actors, but in a lot of ways they're falling into one of two main sides. And you're saying dimes, but what about space? And I say, what about space? And you're saying dimes, but what about the Earth is in orbit around the sun and the moon is orbit around the Earth? That's three bodies. Well, no, that's not really what we mean, because those orbits aren't really dependent on each other. Yeah. So when we say this, it would be three bodies, like three planets in a orbit around each other, not like a few things in orbit around one other large thing.
Yeah, you can classify them in terms of pairs. Like you could say there are, X number of bodies within a certain class within our solar system. But if you go and look at the relationship of each of those bodies to each other, the relationships are determined by primarily, like if you look at the variables in those equations, they're variables drawn from only two bodies normally, right? And even if you look at like what are they called, ternary star systems that have three stars, and you hear about that does exist, but if you go and look at them, what it usually is it's two small stars orbiting closely with a center of gravity, and the center of gravity forms a second body which then orbits the larger star. So you're still looking at two pairs that are interrelated. So like it does actually always break down into pairs. If it's not in pairs, it flies apart. Yeah.
And this is kind of what the idea of an equilibrium is, where you're trying to achieve some kind of balance of forces, and the moment you introduce a third, balance seems almost impossible on a long enough timeline. It might happen very, very fast. So in a geopolitical sense, and this is where we get into Dimes lying, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I would look at the conflict we have in the 21st century between America, we call it the West, but it's mostly just America and Russia and China. So I don't necessarily see this as one versus another. I actually do see three large competing interests that don't, and you might say Russia and China are aligned. Not really, kind of. But this is where the whole Eurasian argument to me falls apart. Like you need to go into a lot more detail about how this would actually work. But so I look at America and China and Russia as actually three competing interests and three very strong identities of themselves and their plans and their goals. And that's why it's so hard to predict. Whereas traditionally, if you look at America versus the Soviet Union, you would have proxy wars and proxy states, but they're all still kind of falling in line with these two juggernauts. And then that's a bit easier to predict than actually a multipolar world. And a true multipolar world is extremely hard to predict. I think that's why a lot of political scientists actually like these empiric or hegemonic structures, because it actually is easier for us to predict in 100 years what might happen, as long as this stability is maintained. If we don't have that, then any fucking thing can happen, and that scares people. That really does, and maybe it should. And so when we talk about rationality, I'll just lead with this as well. They're talking about consistency, like I said before. So a rational being, it's not a value statement on what their motivations are or what they want. It's more about their consistency. So it's like, I'm a rational being if, let's say, this is why you can still have a game theory type transaction between a Saudi and an atheist American. Now, you might say that in a colloquial term, they might say, oh my God, if you're a Muslim, you're irrational. Not really, because if we know we're a Muslim, we can actually lay out what their value sets are. And even though their value sets might be different than the American atheist, being aware of their value sets makes us easier to predict them. Right? We can predict the types of things a Muslim would value. We can tell you like what their belief systems and their views on money, their views on the West. And as long as they're predictable, even if we disagree, we can actually chart out the likelihoods of their decisions. And even though they value things different than us, we can actually create an equilibrium based on that. However, if you think you're dealing with a Muslim and then that Muslim reveals that he's like a progressive Muslim, and he's like, I don't know, this is confusing now. I actually don't know. And I don't know if this game can continue on if I don't know their value sets. And that's where kind of game theory breaks down, is when you don't actually know what the other person wants. And geopolitics work. The discussions we're all having right now about Ukraine and Russia is that we can make a big list of the things Russia wants. This conflict in Ukraine isn't because of one thing. It might be because of 5 to 7 things, but we actually know them. So we're kind of playing a game here. We're observing this sort of game theory. It's like they want these 5 things. Realistically, is there going to be a nuclear war? Does anyone want a nuclear war? No. Okay, so on our values lists of each side, we can actually attach a numerical value to things that they want versus things they don't want. So a negative value would be nuclear war, and a positive value would that be total world peace. And then somewhere in the middle, there's other stuff. So now if we go into this assuming no one wants nuclear war, now we can actually have a transaction and we can have a negotiation. But if we get the sense that maybe they do want a nuclear war, well, that's fucked up. Now we need to reshuffle the deck. Because if they don't hate nuclear war as much as we do, that completely changes the game. Right? I'll give you an example they give in the book on a smaller scale to give you an idea is, let's say a guy kidnaps a woman to put her up for ransom. He's got her in a building. No one knows where he is. And then, she's worried if he's going to kill her. Let's say he gets the money. Now, what actually benefits him? And you can actually chart this on a decision matrix. And what the decision, or a decision tree in this case, there is a decision matrix, but let's say a decision tree. So you know what a decision tree looks like. You got a starting point, and then there's yes, no statements, and they branch off. Like, get paid, don't get paid. Okay, get paid. Then what do? Keep her alive or kill her? That's another subdivision. And what numerical value do you actually place on that? Like, is it better for him if he gets paid and kills her? Is that more safer than getting paid and then not killing her? Now, we can chart that out in a bunch of different branching directions. Fair. Now, what if he falls in love with her? Now that changes the tree completely. That actually attaches a different numerical value. Now, you still have the situation where, let's say he does kill her or doesn't kill her, but keeping her alive, the sort of numerical value he attaches to that is higher, which actually makes her living more likely, right? So the whole decision tree changes the more you impact what their values are, and you impact, what you know about them. So that in this case of like nuclear war, let's say you're dealing with someone who actually doesn't really care about human life as much, or isn't really afraid of nukes, or is more okay with nukes, like that, the numbers are changing on that decision tree, and that's how you're looking at it. And at this entire time, as you can see, it's kind of like chess. You're trying to predict 10 moves ahead.
Yeah.
And this is where you get into something like the prisoner's dilemma. This is another famous game theory thing. So just to give people, this is very kind of rudimentary stuff, but I'm trying to introduce people to what game theory is. So it's a transaction, and you're trying to predict what the other person's going to do. So the prisoner's dilemma is, you're in a jail cell. You and your friend have been arrested. You're in a jail cell. Your other friend's in a jail cell being interrogated by the same detective, and he gives you a deal. They're apprehended for a crime and are held in separate rooms and cannot communicate to each other. The prosecutor informs both suspect 1, you, and suspect 2, your friend, individually, that if he confesses and testifies against the other, he can go free. But if he does not cooperate, but the other person does, he'll get sentenced to 3 years in prison. But if both confess, they'll get a 2-year sentence, and if neither confesses, they'll both be sentenced to 1 year in prison. So now in your mind, you're thinking, okay, the best situation is actually if we don't confess, we'll both get 1 year. However, you're also each thinking, if I confess and the other one doesn't, I go free today, right? So now you're kind of seeing the trick here.
Okay, each partner can do one of two things: stay silent or betray. Staying silent would be cooperating, and betraying would be defecting. If they both stay silent, then they each spend a year in prison. If one betrays and the other stays silent, then the betrayer goes free and the silent spends 3 years in prison. If they both betray, then it's 2 years each. So what are they going to do? Well, they should cooperate. That's the best option for the group if we add the total number of years in prison. But let's take it from Red's perspective. If she thinks Blue is going to stay silent, then she should betray so she can go free. Going free is better than spending a year in prison. If she thinks he's going to betray her, then she should definitely betray. 2 years in jail is better than 3 and being made a fool of. Blue is in the exact same situation and will think the exact same thing. He should betray if she stays silent, and he should betray if she betrays. They should have both cooperated, but from an individual standpoint, they notice they could always gain by defecting, if they have no control over what the other person's going to do. So they'll both defect to try to better their own situation, but come away not only hurting the group, but themselves. Individually, they're worse off than if they both cooperated.
Now, this is what we call a Nash equilibrium. Now, a Nash equilibrium, people might have heard of that from the Jonathan Nash, who was covered in the, I believe, Oscar award-winning movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. It's schizophrenia, came up with the Nash equilibrium. The Nash equilibrium, in each player is assumed to know the equilibrium strategies of other players, and no player has anything to gain by changing their own strategy. But if each player is chosen and no player can increase their own expected payoff by changing their strategy, while the other players keep their unchanged, then the current set of strategic choices that benefits both is the equilibrium. So the idea is a Nash equilibrium is the best case scenario, right? It's the best case scenario. If we both do this one thing, it's not tipped too much on one side, but it's actually an equilibrium where we both kind of get what we want. It's the best case scenario for both sides.
Imagine there are two companies, Game Inc. and Funko, that have to choose whether to advertise or not. They're both well known, so if they choose not to advertise, they will still both make hefty profits, say $100 million. However, if one company fails to advertise while the other goes ahead, many customers will stop buying its products, flocking to the other firm. Its profits will fall to $50 million, while the others will jump to $140 million, which accounts for $10 million in advertising spending. The same will happen the other way around. Conversely, were both companies to advertise, their profits will be a little lower, $90 million each. So what will the companies do? If Game Inc. chooses not to advertise, the best thing Funko can do is to advertise, as it will make more profits. The same is true the other way around. If Game Inc. chooses to advertise, it is also better for Funko to unleash its marketing department, and vice versa. In an ideal world, neither company would advertise, as they would both be better off by staying put. But since each firm fears that the other might advertise, they will both do it, securing slightly lower profits. No company has anything to gain from changing its strategy unilaterally. This is the Nash equilibrium of this game.
That's the Nash equilibrium. So the equilibrium there, the best case scenario would be you individually, it's a zero-sum game. They're getting off and the other guy getting like fucking 10 years. But the best case for both is you both actually confess and only get 1 year compared to the other choices. That's what that means. And, you know, but you get into these sort of downward spirals where now you start thinking, okay, I'm thinking what he's thinking, but he's thinking what I'm thinking. He's thinking that I'm thinking what he's thinking. So you can almost sabotage yourself by doing that. And then there's this thing called a min-max strategy where you try and make the strategy based on the worst case scenario. There's all these little strategies like with names on them. But just to articulate the point that this is a situation where in every case, you're trying to think of based on their values and based on what they know, assuming they know what I know, what would be the best for both of us? And maybe let's assume they're acting rationally. So in every situation, you can kind of find a Nash equilibrium. And when we're talking geopolitics with Russia and Ukraine, and when you look at what people are saying, in a lot of ways, they're looking for an equilibrium. Like, okay, how can this shake out where there's no nuclear war and everyone kind of gets what they want? Which is somewhat what we're seeing right now with Ukraine, where Russia gave Ukraine an ultimatum. And they said, okay, here we'll stop invading and bombing you. You have to promise you're not going to go join NATO. You have to give us the Donbass region, and there's a couple other things there. Basically, what everyone knew they wanted. Now it's like, okay, that given we're now at a transaction. Now you're looking at Zelensky and saying, what's he going to do? Is he going to act irrationally here? And when it comes to what we were talking about, the three body problem, maybe there's more irrationality in these situations than we think, because we're not actually, one versus one here. You know what I mean? Like, we're not actually like two superpowers trading blows. It's very, very complicated. So we're looking at this when we try and call these predictions that we do, we're still coming at it from a game theory sort of way. Like, okay, this would be the smart thing for everyone to do, right? But we're also trying to keep in the back of our minds, well, is the game as simple as we think it is? And I'll give you another thing to think about here. So when we talk about game theory, there's two hemispheres to this to think about. There's regular games, everyday games. What we can call zero-sum games exist in this. A zero-sum game, if you've heard about that before, is when one side wins and another side loses. Balance is achieved. But, in the prisoner's dilemma, the zero-sum game would be, I turn in my partner, he doesn't turn me in, I get off, I win everything, he loses everything. Winner, loser. That's a zero-sum game. And we famously say life is not a zero-sum game. In life, very infrequently do we find situations where one person wins everything and one person loses everything. Sometimes in like older wars, you might get that, where it's just, you lost. Well, we're going to rape you now because no one's going to stop me. You get that. But when we're talking about more complicated games, talk about no zero-sum games. So there actually is no one clear winner, one clear loser. There's kind of an equilibrium being negotiated. And then when we look at like geopolitical issues, we try to say this cannot possibly be a zero-sum game. So, because it would make no sense. It's not a simple transactional game. And that's when people look at game theory, they say, well, how does this apply to the world? Well, here's another way to look at it. So there's regular games, these simple games, then there's infinite games. So the goal of a regular game is to have our transaction, and there will eventually be an end to it. So the war ends, whatever you decide, whatever equilibrium you reach, that's what it is. But then there's an infinite game. And we've talked about this briefly in the past. The purpose of an infinite game is just to keep people playing.
In an infinite game, there are known and unknown players. The rules are changeable, and the objective is to perpetuate the game or stay in the game as long as possible. When we pit a finite player versus a finite player, the system is stable. Football is stable. When we pit an infinite player versus an infinite player, the system is also stable. The Cold War was stable because we could not have a winner or a loser. And what ends up happening is the players play until one drops out because they lack the resources or the will to continue to play. They run out of the will and resources. The game continues with them or without them. The player just leaves the game, right? Problems arise, however, when you pit a finite player versus an infinite player, because one is playing to win and the other is playing to keep playing. And they make profoundly different strategic choices, which ultimately results in the finite player finding themselves in quagmire.
So what does that mean? So we'll get into this later on when we talk about this book called Nudge, but kind of making people think they've actually won a smaller transaction, but by participating in that choice, they've actually just kept this bigger game going. So when we talk about politicians, most political leaders, they tend to deal in these smaller games where there's a winner, there's a loser, there's an equilibrium, whatever. But the larger game being played is globalism. The infinite game is globalism. So nationalists, people like us, we tend to like smaller games where this is the beginning, middle, and end, over, winner, loser, done. But really, the infinite game being played is saying, can we make people make decisions that necessitate this game called globalism, where we are the winners, actually? And who are those people? Well, they can be the multinational corporations. Those could be the people running the UN, the World Economic Forum. This could be the Davos Institute. A lot of the players we've heard about before. So politicians literally cannot play in the larger infinite game being played, which is whatever you want to call it, like a new world order, one world government, whatever. That is a game being played. And a lot of people on our side don't like us talking about that game being played. They want to bring us down to the more practical games, which is fine. I got nothing against that. But just be aware that the larger game being played actually doesn't really play by the same rules. And that by them making you kind of pick sides in a lot of these games, it is kind of perpetuating this larger game. Now, that's not what we're going to get into today. However, but there's a lot of literature about what an infinite game is, and that the players in the game might not be aware that they're playing it, but there are winners, and you might have a difficult time identifying who those winners are. But that's a way to look at the world. That's why you don't need to necessarily believe that this way to model reality is the best way to do it, but it is applicable, I think, to the larger state of the world right now. Hold on, let me just and when they talk about how you can actually represent this mathematically, like we said, you can actually represent it in a decision tree. There's something known as a payoff matrix. You probably, if you look up game theory, you probably see this before. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. It's let's say there's a game about matching pennies. You got two people and they're playing a game. They flip pennies, right? So it's played between two players. One side is even, one side is odd. Each player has a penny and must secretly turn the penny to heads or tails, right? The players then reveal their choices simultaneously. If both pennies match heads or tails, then the guy who's even gets both pennies. However, if one is odd and then the pennies come up odd, that guy gets both pennies. So you can actually chart this, and we'll show this on the clip, like it's a square split into quadrants. And then each kind of square has its own payoff, where it's like if it's both heads, +1, -1 for the other. So you actually, when you look at it, you got a mathematical representation of the odds and win states. And you can chart this on more and more. And you can kind of build it out mathematically for every possible situation if you wanted to. But the idea is what you're doing is just running scenarios. And as you increase in complexity in the scenarios, you could use this sort of predictive model to build like decision trees and kind of shake out what you think the value states are for people based on decisions they actually make. But it's called a payoff matrix. There's probably more other names for it, but that's how I know it as. Now, there's also one thing in game theory, and we kind of touched on this before, about conventions. The idea of conventions, and they're trying to look at this from like a sciencey, rationalistic way, but when we talk about religion and spirituality and cultural norms, they kind of group them under this umbrella called conventions, social conventions. So their claim is most people believing that they're behaving altruistically and good and morally are actually adhering to conventions, whereas it's implied they will benefit by the action without even thinking about it. So their claim, I'm not saying I say this, but it is a way to look at it where being truthful, being a man of your word, playing by the rules, like the reason you do this are because they're moral and ethical. But beneath that, there's also this belief that you are just following these conventions because you think it will benefit you individually. Which can, that's more of a libertarian way of looking at it. Like, if we shake out what the morals are, it's just a negotiation of self-interest. At the end of the day, I get to live an easier life. Living in a high trust society benefits me. Being nice to people means I get niceness back. I'm not saying that's exactly what it is, but that can be a way to look at social conventions, and knowing what the social conventions are of the other, I think actually makes you more capable of dealing with other races, ethnicities, nations and stuff, where it's like, the liberal believes that their morals are just universally right. They have to believe that deep down their opponent is a liberal, and they just need to shake that up. And if I communicate them like a liberal, they'll just see what I'm doing. But if you come at it from where we are, which is like, oh, I don't believe in universal morality, I don't believe in human rights, so when I talk to these people, I need to have a deeper understanding of their social conventions.
Right.
And I need to take them as seriously as they take them. Whereas a liberal, this is where liberals get into trouble. Where they think, oh, their social conventions are just made up. They don't care. Once they see what we're selling, no. So even if you break it down in a very almost rational, materialist way, but it actually does heighten your respect for how other cultures see the world, in a more nationalist or
I don't know about respect, but I mean it's certainly very practical. You might wind up hating them, but yeah.
Oh yeah, you may very well hate the conventions. You might be like their views on talking to a man of a certain age or talking to a woman. It's like I gotta take it seriously that this transaction will go bad if I put a woman in the negotiating position.
Right. And then when you win, you have the luxury of patronizing them and saying what a cute convention you had that lost. But if you lose because you're being liberal about it and treating them as if they would behave the same way as you, and they didn't make that mistake, so they won, and then you're going to really hate them, or you're a liberal, so you're going to pretend you don't. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, and here's also a thing that redeemed game theory for me, because when I read that book by Ken Binmore, he was addressing a lot of this stuff where like, oh, everyone thinks for game theory to work, you gotta be robots. But there are theorists, many of them, who take this into account. And he talks about the folk theorem. And he said the nature of the game changes when both sides know that they're going to be playing multiple versions of that exact same game. So the prisoner's dilemma that we talked about, that takes on a different form if you know you're going to be back there tomorrow with the same guy, right? Or that's what a transaction is. Like the nature of the game, you actually become less cutthroat and less self-interested if you know that you have to deal with these people later, which is why if you're a traveling snake oil salesman, you give less of a shit about manipulating people than if you're just the guy who runs a community store.
It's important to point out that traveling snake oil salesman is redundant. All snake oil salesmen travel for that reason. There's no such thing as a local snake oil salesman who has a brick and mortar shop. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, just that snake oil franchisee.
He's been there for 30 years.
It's a family business. My great granddaddy was selling snake oil to retards. No, but then they say like, so social conventions are emergent phenomena over time. That a lot of these conventions are knowing that it's because we need to deal with each other. And so that also colors globalist and also geopolitical issues. Like, well, we do know that we have to deal with them again at some point. So that is an influence of, well, maybe once we introduce space travel, this will make things way worse. Probably. That's another thing. Like we will end up in a Warhammer 40K world just by the nature that we can go to another planet. And that's where, like, if you get into, we talked about Anthropomorphics, that book by Denis Bouvard about the originary hypothesis, where morals, these heightened things, are really just social conventions that have become codified over time. Now, that doesn't make them less important or even less, important to our soul in that sense, but we do see how they evolve, and that's why they're kind of in the same category of things we need to care about. And the way they look at it is like in every single person, there's a black box which contains their motivations for cooperation. Whereas Marxists and a lot of liberals think that altruism and humanity is in the box. If I'm talking to a Muslim, I think there's a black box inside of them. And in that black box is just this liberal idea that we actually don't care about all this. We all want to get along. And hey, we're workers. So I saw this the other day. I saw this guy named Infrared, named Haz. So actually, I don't dislike Haz, but he was reviewing a Lawrence Southern debate. Lawrence Southern was, I'm getting way into the weeds on this, but I'm going to find my way back. He was reviewing a debate. I'm reviewing a debate between Lawrence Southern and this guy named Mr. Girl, who I think we've talked about before. Strong Tom Green energy from him, and I don't know how to reconcile that. But and Lawrence Southern, by the way, looks like a freak now. She looks like a freak human. I'm going to show this on the clip, but look at her face. She's got like a Twitch gamer. She's covered in makeup, blush, got some kind of plastic surgery everyone knows about, and she's just got that Twitch streamer purple background. It's ghastly. Anyway, what do you say? During this interview, they're talking about race realism or something, and he had made a point where he had said that, I believe Haz is actually more of just a national socialist who likes big fuzzy hats, but he claims to be a Marxist. And he was saying that, poor people, working class people don't actually care about race.
You think there's a racial anxiety within the white working class? No, I don't. The only racial anxiety that I've ever perceived was among upper class people. I've never seen racial anxiety among working class people. I've never witnessed that in my fucking life.
He's got that sort of thing people say when they've never worked a blue collar job, but they have strong opinions about blue collar guys.
Yeah.
They think like, oh, they're like, hey man, put her there. We're working hard. We're construction workers. They don't care if you're black, white, Asian, Indian. I'm like, I've worked in construction. I've worked many blue collar jobs. So have you. Like, if you think they just don't have racial awareness, you're dreaming, and that's a strange dream to have.
Yeah.
Like, you've never even talked to these people. Like, it's true that when white guys and black guys work together, there's a bit more camaraderie. They can get along. Of course they can get along. But when Black Lives Matter comes up, you best believe they're not going to just say, I don't care.
Oh yeah.
Like, get fucking real. Like, you work in a blue collar job. Have there been divisions in your workplace, Judas, on racial, ethnic, identity based grounds?
I mean, blue collar work is an equalizer. I mean, even for me as an employer, like I employ people that I wouldn't be friends with, but I employ them because they have skills that I need, right? And likewise, when you're working on the floor, you're not there to make friends. So I mean, you will get along with people, you will tolerate people that you hate, and we have had feuds on the floor, which have blown up usually much worse after one of the two people quits or is fired. But yeah, I mean, it is an equalizer, but that doesn't, I mean, if you were as an outside observer to look at it, it's like, man, these people all get along. It's like, no, they don't. Get them all at the park at night and they don't know each other. You'll have it'll be a bloodfest. But
hey, and you know what would be the worst thing in the world for them is universal basic income. Because actually, if you don't force them to work together and sell their labor within the capitalist model that you hate, they're more likely to start shooting at each other.
Yeah, they have a lot of free time to just kill each other. Yeah.
Yeah, within the capitalist model, ironically, you might have more cases of that camaraderie, and I see it from your perspective.
It's the same thing we're talking about earlier, that people who trade don't fight, right? If you say that the two of you are interdependent, one of you is going to shovel the dirt and the other one's going to fill the hole back in, you depend on each other, even if you hate each other. You take that job away, and now you're just going to fight over the scraps. So...
Yeah, and just to a point, like, and when we talk about this, when we talk about game theory, what we're trying to do is extend it beyond just these little thought experiments. Like, if you read that book, Thinking Strategically, you'll learn all these strategies. Like, if you were to read a book about chess strategies, yeah, you can memorize a strategy, but you're not a chess master, right? But this idea that we're trying to expand it into the realm of figuring out what the black box is inside the person that controls their actual secret motivations, seeing them as someone who's actually not like you, but having to respect how they're going to come at a situation if you want this negotiation to go well, keeping in mind this idea of like the folk theorem that odds are I am going to be engaging with this person. That makes a zero-sum game less likely, and that changes the equilibrium. And really try and figure out in these complicated situations, am I in a smaller game? Am I in an infinite game? And what is the equilibrium in this infinite game that many globalists are trying to fight? These are the bigger questions you can ask within game theory. I'm not saying that I'm an expert. I'm not saying that it's something that we should attach all of our horses to, but I read this stuff and I've read quite a few books on it. I'm not a mathematician, obviously, so I skip anything with numbers, even letters that look like numbers. Anything with an X in it can lick my nuts. If you think I'm reading a Y, you're dreaming. But outside of that, if you look at this, like there's something here, and I think that while I'm not, hitching my tent to my wagon on game theory, just being in a tent, being dragged by a wagon, and you're in it. I think there's interesting stuff there, and there is an awareness within game theory that it is between humans. And if you are trying to create a system between humans, you have to factor in that they're going to have different motivations and try to get a handle on true irrationality, which is something we're going to get to later. But anyway, that's all I really wanted to say about maybe a very, very brief introduction to game theory.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.